It's Tuesday, December 12th, 2023. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Russell Oral History Documentary Collection, sponsored by the University of Georgia's Richard B. Russell Library. I'm joined today by Dr. Ronald Keith Gaddy of TCU, and we're in the office of former Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, Governor Keating grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, attended Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He later attended University of Oklahoma College of Law, earning his JD in 1969, and then went on to have a 30-plus year career in law enforcement and elective office, including time as an FBI agent, U.S. Attorney, Oklahoma State Prosecutor, member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives and State Senate, as well as 2 terms as Governor of Oklahoma. He has also held positions in the federal judiciary, justice, and HUD departments. During his time as governor, his time as governor coincided with the 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building by domestic terrorists. His response during and after that tragedy won national and international acclaim. He's a former partner of the firm of Holland and Knight, as well as past president and CEO of the American Council of Life Insurers and the American Bankers Association. He is currently a member of the University of Oklahoma Board of Regents, a position he's held since 2017. Governor Keating, thank you so much for hosting Keith and me here at your office in Oklahoma City.
It was a pleasure seeing both of you, and I will offer each of you a second cup of coffee. It's been a joy.
It's more than we deserve, I assure you. So you grew up in St. Louis, my neck of the woods. Tell me how you grew up there, but you were born there, but grew up in Tulsa. Tell me how that happened.
Well, my grandparents and my mother and dad were in Salem, Illinois. Dad was a roughneck on a drilling rig and college graduate. Show you how desperate the Depression was. Milkman, steel worker. And when he came to Illinois, he was working for an oil well supply company. Mm-hmm. And there was no hospital in Salem, so my mother trekked to St. Louis to now Jewish Barnes. Then it was Barnes Hospital, and that's where my twin brother and I were born.
Okay, my sister-in-law worked at Barnes for a number of years. Now she works at Cardinal Glennon, the Catholic hospital. So growing up in Tulsa, something I learned in college was one of the professors that I had at Westminster. His major area of study was the Tulsa Race Massacre. Right. Was that something that people of your generation, especially in the white community in Tulsa, were familiar with or learned about?
Well, tragically, no. I went to a Catholic school, and I don't think it was the fact that the Catholic Augustinians didn't want to tell us about it, because children would say, now what's that all about? Why would people do that? But I think that they simply had no knowledge of it. It was a hidden fact.
Right.
But no, my father, when I was in a horse show in Tulsa, I told him I needed to go to the bathroom, and he said, go over there where there's an arrow pointing down, a black arrow, and that's where you go. And it said colored only during the period of segregation and racism. When I came back, I said, Dad, what's colored only mean? He said, that's the reason you'll never be a Democrat. That is the party of the Civil War, the party of the Ku Klux Klan, racism, the poll tax, and he just was adamant about it, even though my mother was a Democrat and Dad was a Republican. So I was a Republican and very active counsel of the Civil War to NAACP when I was a young legislator.
So here in Oklahoma, that made you something of an oddity, or at least a minority in political circles.
Well, I think that Republicans didn't really know how significant the civil rights movement was and how important the Republican involvement, the party of Lincoln, was in that, but also how important the Democratic Party was to change. And Lyndon Johnson obviously was a Democrat, the father of a lot of the civil rights legislation nationally. But we needed to know what our history was. And there's good news and bad news as we analyze the history of Oklahoma, the history of the United States. And we're overcoming some of those fears now. But the Tulsa Race Massacre, there's some wonderful books about it. But I know there were a lot of very fine people Dr. Kerr, who was then the rector of the First Presbyterian Church, used his church as a refuge. The same thing with the Catholic Cathedral, but the brutality of the race massacre, later called the race riot, was really not known by most people, and I never learned it in school.
Well, when do you recall becoming interested in politics as something that you followed regularly?
Well, I came from a culture. My dad, as I mentioned, was a Republican. My grandfather, my mother's dad, was state treasurer of Illinois, a Democrat. He was a member of Congress. He only served one term and then didn't run again. But Dad's insistence to all of us was, you have an obligation of citizenship. That obligation of citizenship means to serve. Nature abhors a vacuum. And if you don't get involved, somebody who's no good will be involved, and you can't have that happen. So it was just whether it was school politics, and I was president of my student body in high school, college, and law school. So that was just part of the learning experience that I had. I went to school in D.C., was there, and when President Kennedy was murdered, and things like that really wake you up to the tragedy, the commitment needed, and the obligations of citizenship, and in my judgment, to serve in some capacity, whether it's on a school board or a member of the legislature or governor of a state. I think we all have an obligation to serve.
Well, as just for sort of a public service announcement, you were also a history major in college, which is always really important, and I like to highlight that in interviews like this. What attracted you to the study of history, and how did you apply that to your later career, either in law school, law enforcement, and in politics?
I was always fascinated with American history, and going to Georgetown undergraduate school, obviously every major Civil War battlefield was within a stone's throw of Washington, D.C. Georgetown was founded in 1789, the year, obviously, of the Constitution of the United States. And the colors of that school are blue and gray, because many of the students who were killed in the war were Union soldiers. Many of them also were Confederates. But Oklahoma had, to me, and my dad would insist that I go around and visit some of the sites in Oklahoma, the oldest building at Fort Gibson, for example, or the Battle of Washita, Custer's battle out in the western part of the state. But to take a piece of land, a great big piece of land, and to open it to settlement by just anybody who wanted to queue up and ride their horse in was fascinating to me. The only state that did that. And I got interested I had a lot of Native American friends. I had a lot of Jewish friends, because in those days, if you were a Catholic, you were persona non grata in some circles. But I just lived in an environment that was very much interdependent and inclusionary, and I think as an American, that's probably the best environment to be raised in.
Well, what compelled you to come back to Oklahoma for law school? Had you considered other places? Had you considered staying in Washington, or did you always know that you wanted to come back to Oklahoma to study law?
Well, when I wanted to go to college, my dad had reversals in business, and he said, I've got your tuition paid for. My twin brother went to Villanova, another Catholic school. My older brother went to Holy Cross, another Catholic school in Massachusetts. But he said, I've got your education paid for. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the country. You'll go up there, you'll think it's really interesting, fascinating, learn a lot, but then you need to come home. And so I just never thought of not coming home when I graduated from college, but I asked my dad, what should I do? Because, I need to do something, get an advanced degree. It was during Vietnam, and I had a very high draft number, I mean, way up where I would never be drafted. So I was going to become a lawyer with the U.S. Marine Corps. My twin brother was a Marine officer in Vietnam, so I had an interview, decided that's what I wanted to do. Then the FBI showed up at OU Law School and said, we really need agents. And there were a couple of us thought, well, that would be kind of fun. And but before I went to law school, I asked my dad, what should I do? I graduated from college, and thank you for making that possible, Dad. But what should I do? And he said, you need to go to law school. Dad wasn't a lawyer. And I said, why? I'm not sure I want to be a lawyer. He said, then you can tell the lawyers no. And I thought that was the best advice I'd ever gotten. And I used that many times in life, in the federal government, particularly as, I was in charge of virtually all the law enforcement established in the Secret Service, ATF, Customs, prisons, Marshals, Interpol, the Immigration Service, Border Patrol, all that stuff. And I got into rows sometimes with the general counsels of Treasury and Justice and HUD, and I'd say, no, that's not right. Show me, where you're right, and I'll agree. And a good example of that, by the way, was at HUD when I was general counsel. Some of the residents wanted to put a cross, crucifix, or a cross in one of the meeting areas, and the HUD legal department said they couldn't do it. And I said, why not? Well, because that's a religious symbol. And I said, no, we don't want to make that symbol the official symbol of Department of Housing and Urban Development. But what's wrong with having the right of residents to have a cross or a menorah, whatever the symbol might be, at their meeting space? I mean, there's nothing wrong with religion as long as it's not sponsored by us. But to let them use their property the way they wish to is perfectly fine with me, as long as they don't exclude other people. So everybody said, oh, okay.
Well, more immediately for your job prospects, I believe to be an FBI special agent at the time, you had to either be a lawyer or an accountant.
That's right. Well,
So-
a CPA.
See, not just an accounting degree, you had to be board certified,
Right.
A CPA. So you were assigned out west. You were saying earlier. So you were a West Coast special agent. What sort of what was your work out there? What were the cases you were
Well,
tracking
really
down?
everything, because in those days, and I think that's one of the reasons the FBI was strong and well respected. Politics was not a part of our discussion. You read about senior FBI officials participating in what amount to political discussions. We never did that. That's the decision of the U.S. Attorney. We'll investigate a case, present it to an assistant U.S. Attorney for a prosecutive opinion. He says yes, he says no, and that's where we go. I remember one time in San Francisco, I had to interview the mayor of the city. And he said, well, you're probably one of these Nixon guys. And I said, well, sir, I don't know what your politics are. And quite truthfully, it's not relevant to me. But I have several leads to ask you questions about a case that we're investigating. And if you don't mind, I just need to ask those questions. He said, well, okay. But today you'd probably find out that people were political. That just wasn't acceptable in my time. I mean, it's like in Dragnet, the TV show many, many years ago, just the facts, man. Just the facts.
Joe Friday.
Yeah, you better believe it.
So you were there when J. Edgar Hoover was director.
Yeah, he was
still.
the director at the time. Yeah, and something, I know there are a lot of people that don't think much of Hoover, but for me as an agent, no one ever suggested to me what my politics are to be. I happen to be a Republican because that was my family's choice and my choice. But, I had a partner who was Jewish and a Democrat. I mean, we didn't argue about anything. It was just, to me, a part of life. You had different value systems and beliefs than others. But when I was an assistant DA, when I was the United States Attorney, when I supervised all of the U.S. attorneys nationally, my emphasis was on, if we have a crime that's been committed, then we need to find out who did it. And we certainly are not going to participate in framing anybody, because that means the real person's out there. And we want to make sure we get the person responsible and see that they are prosecuted. That was just basically the Bible I live by as a law enforcement person.
So in Northern California at that time, you would have been involved in cases related to Black Panthers, sort of different fringe New Left groups.
Right. Well, no, matter of fact, when I was in Berkeley, in the resident agency in Berkeley, I had been assigned to San Francisco. The head of the FBI office in Berkeley was a guy named Don Jones, great, big, impressive guy. And he said, have you ever been in one of the Berkeley demonstrations? Of course, after that, I got used to CS gas. You know, you smell it every day. I mean, it was kind of
it's
sickening.
In your clothes.
Yeah, but I mean, so the two of us were standing there, and the Berkeley, the UC Berkeley police department were guys in their 20s with clubs. It wasn't old men with big bellies and white hats. And so we're sitting there watching all this, and people were picking up rocks and bottles and pieces of lead to, you know, get it on with the police. And this girl turned around pointing her finger at Don Jones standing next to me. She said, look, 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 Chief FBI Pig, right here, Chief FBI Pig. So Don said, thank you, comrade, have a good day. And he walked through the police line there, and I'm all by myself. And this girl looked at me and she said, can you believe this, S? You could be standing right next to a pig and not know it. Well, that was the beginning of my introduction. But it was a wild scene. I mean, Berkeley was wild. Just, Jim, I did internal security, I did thefts on government reservations, all sorts of investigative matters. And I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of finding out if someone did it or not, and make sure that that person was suitably punished or released, or, you know.
And I assume that sort of mentality is what played into your decision to move back to Oklahoma and begin your career as a prosecutor.
Well, I mean, I was not happy with the caliber of some of the assistant U.S. attorneys that I presented cases to. I remember one time in trial, it was not unusual for assistant U.S. attorneys not to object to a line of questioning from a defense attorney. Well, I was very aggressive later as a prosecutor. If the question's irrelevant, it shouldn't be answered. I remember one guy asked me, he said, where are you from? The defense attorney. And I said, how do you mean? He said, what state are you from? I said, from Oklahoma. He said, Oklahoma is Smokelahoma. Where's that? And I looked at the assistant U.S. attorney, why don't you object to this? I mean, the line of questioning has nothing to do with the guilt or innocence of the person that this guy's representing. So I went home and decided to be a prosecutor, and I tried a bunch of cases as a felony trial prosecutor, and then later as number of years later as United States Attorney.
And at what point did you decide to move into elective office or into elective politics?
Well, after I finished several years as an assistant district attorney, you know, quite truthfully, before I was the United States Attorney, Republicans weren't frequently elected, but there was an opening in the state house in Tulsa, and the incumbent was a Republican, and it happened to be my neighborhood. So I thought, well, this might be kind of interesting to be a member of the legislature. That no one had ever been a member of the legislature in my family, so I served one term in the state house, didn't run again. There were 25 of us Republicans out of 101. Then I ran for the state senate, and I served really a term and a half. There were 7 of us out of 48, and I was the Republican leader, and that was a hoot, and because there weren't any Republicans to matter. But I really was introduced to the need for bipartisanship, and I got along well with the House and Senate people. I would ask if I had a bill that I felt should be introduced and considered, I would have to get a Democrat to sponsor it. I'd be a secondary sponsor, but that was fine. I mean, I guess I felt like an African American in Alabama in 1950 because, yeah, I mean, you couldn't do anything by yourself.
Well, I was about to say it was going to have to be fine. No, what else were you?
Yeah, no, that's right. But I got to where I really admired a lot of the men and women in the legislature of both parties. Like our caucus, we had a registered nurse, we had an MD. We had a Democrat caucus, guy became a really good friend of mine, was a special forces officer in Vietnam. And I got along with those guys. I thought we could do a lot together, and we did a lot.
In Georgia, during this period of one-party rule, one-party Democratic rule, you had a lot of ideological diversity within the Democratic Party. You had liberal factions, conservative factions, moderate factions, rural-urban divides. Was that the same here in Oklahoma?
Well, kind of like my granddad, I don't expect that he died when I was a little boy, but I can't imagine that he was a hard left-wing ideologue. My mother wasn't, my dad wasn't as a Republican, and in the legislature, it was humorous to follow some of the debates of some of these guys. The rural Democrats were comedy acts. I mean, and they were very effective. For example, there was a Democrat legislator who introduced a bill to require a hunting license for a boy or girl born after such and such a date. And so I thought, well, that's probably a pretty good idea, to be trained how to use a gun, to have a background investigation and know what you're doing if you have a handgun or a shotgun or a rifle. For that matter, well, we had a notorious state senator named Gene Stipe, a Democrat, no surprise, and he asked that this other Democrat yield, and he said, now, Senator, let me ask you, so you're saying that in order to go hunting, you got to have a license? And he said, yes, sir, you have to get a license. Well, let's say this little boy in my district, he's told by his mama to go out and shoot a rabbit for supper. He's got to take a course before he can shoot a rabbit for supper. And everybody started to smile. And he said, well, let me just tell you, before this discussion ends, this is no more and no less than gun control. Well, of course, everybody voted no. I voted for it, but everybody else voted no. And then later, of course, we passed a law requiring a hunting license or a fishing license before you could hunt or fish. But that was the kind of humor in the legislature, and it was hugely effective. Stipe is one of the great trial lawyers in the state.
What was the Democratic leadership like? In a lot of these southern states, Democratic-run southern states, the leadership was out to quash the Republican minority, if they paid any attention to it at all. Was that the same way here in Oklahoma?
No, I mean, quite truthfully, my Democrat friends or my Democrat colleagues didn't really feel that there was any fear from Republicans. Okay. I mean, 7 Republican senators out of 48 or 25 out of 101. And that had always been that way. Back way in the 20s, Republicans had a majority once. I think it was in the state house. But no, as I said, if you wanted to pass something, you went to a Democrat and asked that person to author it. And there were some horrible laws that needed to be repealed. And Democrats, because they weren't fearful of us, they were willing to work with us, and to suggest that there was no conversation is silly, but obviously they determined whether the sun rose in the east or the west, and we didn't.
Well, the 1980 presidential election is sort of a hinge point in your political career. Were you a supporter of Ronald Reagan when he was running for president, or were you backing another Republican in that race?
Well, I don't remember who the other Republicans were, but I, became very much. I thought the thing about Ronald Reagan that impressed me was he was a man of humility. I mean, he was a smart guy. Later, of course, I had an opportunity to brief the cabinet on a number of occasions when President Reagan was sitting at the head of the table. But he was the quintessential patriot, a very fine individual who got along well with both parties. That's a good person to learn from. If you're in government, you got to make it work. The only way you can make it work is working with your colleagues of both parties. I mean, today there are some crazy Democrats and crazy Republicans, and good Democrats and good Republicans. You just got to ally with people that can help you. I just finished a book, by the way, yesterday by my friend Ben Nelson, who is governor of Nebraska and a senator from Nebraska, a Democrat. It's a very good book about the need to work together with the other side. And I disagree with some of the things he said in the book, But all in all, he talked about the importance of working together, and he was absolutely right.
So President Reagan is the one who appoints you to as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District.
Yeah, I was confirmed by the Senate 4 times.
Okay.
3 times under Reagan and 1 time under H.W. Bush.
Unanimously, or were there some real anti-Keating folks out there?
Well, I mean, I would, when I United States Attorney, because I was next FBI agent, I'm sure some people looked at me quizzically. Are you going to be open-minded to individuals that come before you? I don't recall that there was much of a distance between the parties on me. To work at Treasury, to be in charge of the law enforcement agencies at Treasury. Same thing, to be Ed Meese's, and that was Jim Baker, who was then the secretary. Ed Meese is Attorney General, and I was the guy in charge of all the law enforcement side at the Justice Department. And no, I testified a lot before House and Senate members, Republicans and Democrats, and I mean, it was all factual. It wasn't, why were you born? I mean, none of that stuff. So I had no problem. And, the only problem I faced was as general counsel of HUD, and I was the deputy secretary, and Jack Kemp's right arm or left arm, however you want to describe it. But I was nominated for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And I got the highest rating by the American Bar Association. And when I had my hearing, several Democrats, homed in on me. They thought I was too conservative to be an appellate judge. And I remember in front of that whole committee, Judiciary Committee, I said, well, Senator, are you aware of the fact that I was state counsel to the NAACP in Oklahoma? And they all looked at each other like, oh, we didn't know about that. So, Bill Clinton was elected president, and I got left at the altar as a 10th Circuit judge, which was fine with me. And I, later came home and ran for governor. But what was fascinating, and it would never happen today, about that was even though President Clinton was elected, obviously they weren't going to confirm me, but he and I went to school together. I'm, 2 years older, but he contacted some of the members to say, Frank Keating's a good man. We ought to, confirm him. As it turns out, I'm not disappointed that I wasn't confirmed, but Jack Kemp one day came to my office. He said, you won't believe this. You know who's coming up here to make phone calls for you for the 10th Circuit? And I'm going to have her call in your office. And I said, who? And he said, Coretta Scott King. And so Mrs. King came, sat next to me, called Metzenbaum, Biden, and Kennedy. All
Wow.
People who weren't for me. And I was fascinated. Would you ever see that today? Probably not. But, Mrs. King, I just loved her. And I sent her, I remember afterwards, a dozen red roses. And she called me and said, all the things I've done for people, no one ever sent me roses as a thank you. So I didn't have very much money, working for Uncle Sam. But that was an example of, the Mrs. King coming to a Republican judicial candidate's office to encourage him to be confirmed. That just didn't happen.
And if I have my facts straight, I think the chairman of that Judiciary Committee would have been somebody named Joe Biden.
That's correct, yeah.
He also, his career turned out all right too.
Yeah, he did okay.
He did okay, just like you. He did all right. So you named three individuals who were your superiors, your bosses when you were in Washington: Ed Meese, Jim Baker, and Jack Kemp. Those are real three, heavyweights of Republican politics in the 1980s. Jim Baker's the man who ran Washington, according to his biography. Tell me about what your experiences were with those three men and what you learned from your time working with them.
Well, Jim Baker was more interested in diplomacy, later became Secretary of State. He really wasn't that interested in law enforcement, in the law enforcement bureaus. But I respected him because he was, to your point, highly thought of. He was a Texan. I doubt if he ever cheered for the Sooners. But I respected him greatly. Ed Meese and I were very close. we thought alike. He was Heritage Foundation fellow later. And Jack Kemp was, a wonderful friend. He would bring a glass of red wine into my office. We had joined each other on occasion, and we would gossip. I remember one time Jack said to me, "You know the difference between rich people and poor people?" And I said, "Pardon me?" He said, the difference between rich people and poor people. I said, no. He said, rich people have more money. Other than that, there's no difference. I mean, but that's the thing that's so wonderful about Kemp, because how many African-American linemen saved his life, as a professional football player? But that was just the culture that those guys, to imagine any of them would say, well, anti-Jewish language, it depends on the context. I mean, they would never say that because they didn't believe it.
Well, to put that into context, we're referring to the Ivy League president,
yes.
Former president of
Well, and the sad thing is
University of
a very
Pennsylvania.
wonderful law firm advised them. I just can't believe that they didn't get into the nitty and the gritty in the conversation, because those people surely know better than that. But anyway, that's another subject for another conversation.
Well, tell me about your decision to, you were successfully inoculated from Potomac fever by your father very early on in your life. So you didn't stay in Washington full time. You came back here to Oklahoma. Did you come back knowing you wanted to run for governor or would run for governor?
Well, no, when I got left at the altar to be a 10th Circuit judge, I thought of other options.
Okay.
The president calls you to be a circuit judge. The senator calls you to be a U.S. district judge. Of course, the president calls you to be on the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Well, I knew that President Bush, H.W., was going to call me and ask me. Said, "I'm going to nominate you for the 10th Circuit." Well, I was afraid to tell my wife because she kind of liked the D.C. life. And so when the president called me, I said, "Mr. President, how are you? Nice to talk." And I knew him really pretty well. I had a lot of meetings with him in my jobs in D.C. When he was vice president as well as when he was the president. And he said, "Well, I want to nominate you, and I'm going to. I just want to mention that. I'm proud of you, et cetera, et cetera." And my wife was shaking her head like that. And fortunately, I guess for her, I got left at the altar. But Kathy and I wanted to come back. I had two brothers then. There were three of us. None of them are living anymore, sadly. But they lived here. Kathy's mom lived here. My parents. I mean, it was, why not come back home? And I needed to earn a living. And so I went back to D.C. as head of the life insurance industry trade group and also head of the banks. So I went from 400 happy state-regulated life insurance CEOs to 5,500 frequently unhappy bank CEOs supervised by the federal government. Very different.
Well, let's talk about that campaign for governor in 1994. It's sort of a unique campaign. You won your primary with very little opposition. Tell me about that three-way campaign between you, Jack, Mildred, and Wes
Watkins.
Wes Watkins.
Well, there was an individual who owned at the time, later became dean of the business school at Oklahoma City University, who owned a very creative restaurant chain called Molly Murphy's. Mm-hmm. And so I, as a lawyer, represented them, always getting the kids out of jail because you couldn't sell mixed drinks during that time. So these college students trying to earn a living got arrested, and I got them out of jail and got deferred sentences, no conviction for them. But when I know the guy that owned this group of restaurants was from Connecticut. He was a Catholic, and he was a saloon keeper. The poll showed he would be elected governor. And I went, what? So my reaction was, Oklahoma is very different now. So I said, I'm going to take a look at running for governor. And I came home, and my dad kind of rolled his eyes. This is a Democratic state, good luck. And I know the first big discussion we had, the whole auditorium, if you will, were Molly Murphy's employees, cheering for their candidate. And yet I thought, if the state has changed where, somebody from out of state, he was a Catholic, as I was. I thought a Catholic couldn't get elected in anything. It's a very different state. But the big challenge was Jack Mildren, who was a great football player at OU. He was a lieutenant governor. And also in the Democratic primary was a member of the state Senate who said she kicked off her shoes. She was had been pulled down and attacked by a mugger, and she chased after this guy and knocked him down. And I thought, my law enforcement credentials were pretty solid at the time. Jack Mildren, God love him, he's in paradise, but was not much of a debater, but this gal was. And then I found out, to my surprise and relief, the police said she never knocked anybody down, never would even help them find out who did it. And I said, I'm in. So I squeaked in. I mean, it was not easy, but the public was very open-minded to a change. And, we had the county commissioner scandal, we had the judge scandal, we had obviously the issues involving the scandal in Osage County, the killers of the Flower Moon. A lot of people didn't know anything about that. But what did it say? The people weren't really happy with their leaders. And so I had a chance to win and worked hard with the Democrats to make that a success.
Because you were only, go ahead, Keith.
Actually, it's sort of fascinating because your campaign against Vince Orr is wonderful. But I actually wanted to ask you, as governor, you were able to have legislative accomplishments while only holding a little bit more than 1/3 of one chamber.
Right.
How do you make use of the veto that way? How do you win under those circumstances?
Well, I think the smartest thing I ever did, and I've suggested subsequent governors of both parties to do it, and they didn't do it. But I had the University of Oklahoma and the Oklahoma State University economics departments to examine why are we poor. Yeah. We were 45th in per capita personal income, and they came back with an analysis. And then OU and OSU, no one could say those guys didn't know what they were doing. This wasn't the Heritage Foundation. These were OU and OSU, our flagship universities. They said, well, you don't have a right to work. You tax everything. The kids don't take hard enough courses in school. The transportation infrastructure sucks. You have too much divorce. Other than that, everything's fine. And so I gave to the Democrat leadership, okay, here's how we get out of the hole. And so we passed right to work in the Constitution. I was a father of charter schools. I wanted to get rid of the personal and corporate income tax. I wouldn't go along with that, but we reduced taxes. We got public charter schools, finished the transportation infrastructure, even those wires, protecting against head-on collisions. We were the first state in the union to do that. Really? We asked for forgiveness rather than permission from the feds. And I just said, the last people laughing are the Texans if we don't get our house in order. So we moved from 45th to 37th per capita personal income. But since then, members of both parties have not done a thing about getting rid of the personal and corporate income tax. That's what holds us back. And the public school system is very, very weak and not particularly focused on rigor in academics. The finest schools in Oklahoma are the charter schools. By far, they're the best academic schools, and to be head of the charter schools. But what helped me have strength at the table was I vetoed 302 bills, and none were overridden, because this little group of Republicans sustained every bill, every veto. You contrast that to other governors, they don't think it's a big deal if they get overridden. Oh, yes, it is, because it shows you really don't have the kind of strength you need. And so the Democrats said to me, what do you want? A vote on right to work in the Constitution, charter schools, school choice, reduce taxes, fix every town of 10,000 or more connected to the interstate system by a 4-lane highway. In other words, they all said, okay, and we all worked together and got it done.
Now, there's one thing, this is only my second or third time in Oklahoma. I have to ask about all these turnpikes and toll roads that you guys have in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, actually, it's pretty smart. I was the guy that raised the speed limit, turnpike speed limit to 75. But if
you have my appreciation.
Well, no, if you want to go from Oklahoma City to Tulsa on a free road, that's easy to do, or anywhere. It's easy to take a free road. Now, on the other hand, if you want to go 75 miles an hour to get to your destination, you can use that turnpike system to go really 75 or more to get to your destination. And it's worked very, very well. People like to have options. And if you don't have an option, if I had to pay to get on a road and I had no other way to get there, it's kind of like going to Kansas. You know, here I-35 in Oklahoma is all free road, all throughout, Interstate 40, 235. But in Kansas, once you get to the Kansas border, boom, and it's toll road on Interstate 35. See, I don't think that should be, but because there's no other option, unless I'm ignorant, forgive my Kansas friends, but in Oklahoma, you can take a free road to get anywhere if you want to. If you want to get there faster, you can use a turnpike.
So I like the way you explained it. It's more of an express lane that in Atlanta.
Yeah,
in Atlanta you have express lanes on the interstate.
In DC we had express lanes.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I hate to shift to something that is very tragic and horrible to talk about, but 3 months into your first term as governor, April 19th. Walk me through that day when Timothy McVeigh set off the bomb at the Murrah Federal Building.
Well, none of us can conceive of the evil of an individual who cased the joint, who knew that there was a children's center in the Murrah Federal Building, and who knew that there were men, women, and children, Social Security office and the like. Well, the building was filled with innocent human beings that weren't guerrillas. And McVeigh cased the joint, saw exactly what he was in a position to do, and he blew it up. It makes you a real firm believer in capital punishment, by the way, certainly for somebody like that. But what was impressive to me was even in that horror, people dropped everything to come and help. And that's where this Oklahoma Standard came from. Why? Well, 302 buildings were damaged or destroyed as a result, and there was no active looting anywhere. There were bank teller stations open, money going everywhere. No one did anything. I remember one time when the urban search and rescue teams, the FEMA teams came in to help us. One team from Northern Virginia, when they were leaving, my wife and I, Kathy and I were, thank you so much to all of them for being in Oklahoma. One guy took a dollar bill out of his pocket and waved it in the air, and he said, "Hey, Governor, you know what this is?" And I said, "I'm in politics. I know that's a dollar bill." And he laughed, said, "This isn't any dollar. It's an Oklahoma dollar. I came here, never had to pay a dime for a meal anywhere in town, never had to pay a nickel for anything, anywhere." When we went to New York for the first Trade Center bombing, he said, he didn't say the first trade, but it was the first Trade Center bombing. We had to pay $5 for a sack of ice. And in Oklahoma, laundry, telephones in, pre-cell phone, meals. They just couldn't believe it, how wonderfully generous the Oklahoma people were, and competent, because this was the only horror of that magnitude where the feds left the state authorities in charge. No one tried to bump me out of the way. That did not happen, let's say, after Hurricane Katrina. That just was not the case. So we found, who was responsible, tried, convicted, and executed him, and it's just sad that all those wonderful, wonderful people are gone, because many of them were friends of mine.
What interaction did you have with President Clinton and the White House the day of and in the days after that bombing?
Well, he called me shortly after the bombing. He said, "What in the world's going on in Oklahoma City? I understand somebody tried to blow up the federal building." And I said, "Well, they did. I mean, I don't know if they thought at first it was a natural gas explosion." I said, "That can't be a natural gas explosion. I mean, the might, the force, the ferocity of that bombing had to be intended by somebody." And he said, "Well, what do you need?" And I said, "Well, Oklahoma City has 1,000 firefighters. They're going to be exhausted, shortly. How many victims are there? It was a full office building. I don't know, but whatever you can send, we need." Well, so they sent these urban search and rescue teams, the FEMA teams. A lot of those guys I've seen in the airport getting their bags, a lot of them stuck around when they retired. They came back to Oklahoma to live. They just couldn't believe how wonderful the people were.
I can remember, because I was 8 or 9 at the time, I can remember watching on TV when President Clinton, I think Reverend Billy Graham, came to Oklahoma City. That was a very powerful speech I remember as a child. Tell me about what that, the president coming and coming together with a Republican governor, what that meant at that time.
Well, President Clinton and I went to school together.
Yeah.
I knew him. He called me asking what he could do, and he did a great job, and he's been returning every anniversary. If we have a 5th anniversary,
Really?
10th anniversary, 15th, he always comes. As a matter of fact, I remember Merrick Garland came with him the last time. He was here at the same time that Bill Clinton was. But it was wonderful, the commitment of the help from all over. But as I said, what was remarkable to me was the feds did not push us out of the way. They felt that, who was the head of the National Guard? A 2-star general that I appointed that happened to be a Democrat and was really a solid, wonderful person. A lot of those guys knew me from my DC service. Like the Secret Service lost 6 agents. That was the worst day in the history of the U.S. Secret Service. And every year here they all come again, those that survived. But it was a horror show, but people really respected the competency of Oklahoma City, the courage, the inclusion, the religiosity, quite truthfully, of the response, like the Billy Graham event that my wife organized and put on. And it was the worst day in the history of Oklahoma City, but as a result, Oklahoma Cityans have a very different view of themselves, very confident and very proud of their community.
What did the state of Oklahoma, in terms of policy, I suppose, do for the victims of the bombings, survivors of the bombings?
Well, I made a decision that this was not, we weren't an insurance company. We didn't ask Uncle Sam for any money. Unlike 9/11, I mean, they asked for lots and lots of money, but we didn't ask for any money. So we had $7 million that came in. By the way, the first significant check, 6-figure or 5-figure check, came from the Muslim community of Oklahoma City, because I made the comment when people said, "Is this a Middle East terrorist event?" Well, I said, "We don't know who did it. So before we jump to conclusions, let's make sure we know who did it." Well, the guy that did it was a fall-away Catholic, looked like me or you. But, the reality is that Oklahoma learned a lot, that the rest of the country learned a lot from how we very, very competently responded, but we all wish it never had happened.
I'm sure. In your second term, you took part in, it was a tabletop exercise at Andrews Air Force Base, Dark Winter. Tell me about how you drew on your experiences, your real life experiences dealing with the Oklahoma City bombing, and the sort of lessons from that tabletop exercise, which was, I believe, it gamed out a smallpox outbreak.
Yeah, it was a smallpox outbreak in Oklahoma City. And I think exercises like that are hugely important. Then you know what you're supposed to do or not do. But I was, the crocodile in the sandwich, because I'd say you can't do that. What's this? And the president was, and they were all, retired four-star generals. The president was a senior senator from Georgia.
Senator Nunn.
And it was wonderful. But when this event occurred, now what do? The medical community had no idea what to do about smallpox, because there were very few smallpox, anti-smallpox dosage units. And, they all wanted to have everybody have the military take over and I said, and those few dosage units would go to the military that came here. And I said, are you out of your mind? We're going to need these dosage units to get doctors and nurses willing to go into a hospital to treat people. I went, oh yeah, maybe we ought to do that. Those kind of exercises are so important. I've been in a number of them, responses to nuclear, radiological, biological, or radiological events, and we don't do those anymore. Matter of fact, there was never a hearing on Capitol Hill about Dark Winter. And it was at Andrews Air Force Base. All these retired generals, the same thing with all these other exercises, because the Congress doesn't want to have people realize how panicked they ought to be that we don't have any dosage units for smallpox. I mean, look with the COVID experience.
Right.
Everybody's floundering around trying to figure out what to do. Why weren't things like that murder boarded? Have they been murder boarded since COVID for another COVID event? Probably the answer is no. Because if they had, and they had hearings on Capitol Hill, you'd know about it.
Well, that's discouraging.
Yeah, very discouraging.
Well, what was the response, coming out of Dark Winter and some of the others? For example, maybe let's talk Dark Winter, because that's the one that's most front and center, especially after COVID. What steps could the federal government and the state governments take? Is this a line of communication? Is this Defense Production Act? What are the lessons that can be learned that you learn from these exercises?
To find out, what are the bad things being developed by bad people, and if in fact smallpox is an example, or another COVID-related or connected disease, I'm not sure, plague, there ought to be, through CDC, exercises with, matter of fact, the real sad thing is in most states, there is no knowledge at all about any of this by the state authorities. Well, don't blame them, blame the federal government, who could say, we got to tell you, it's some bad people in China doing X, or bad people in, wherever it might be doing Y. And you need to prepare for that, and then take those lessons learned to each state and say, okay, let's get ready. What do you do in the event of? Because if you have, like COVID, for example, we were floundering around to figure out what's the impact on children. Well, virtually none. And yet we didn't learn that until much later, so we closed all the schools. And that was a mistake. At least I think it was a mistake from what I've read. But those are the kind of things, exercises run by Uncle Sam, where all the states participate through their senior leadership individually and collectively, so we don't make the same mistake twice.
Well, something more upbeat and something that I just learned about was that your Capitol building didn't have a dome until 2002.
Right.
Why was that, and how did that change?
Well, we ran out of money to build the Capitol building because we wanted to, World War I started, and we wanted to build a veterans hospital, or provide facilities for returning veterans.
Certainly a worthier cause than a dome.
There wasn't the Department of Veterans Affairs at the time. So the legislature didn't want to give a Republican any money to build the dome, So I raised it privately from Oklahoma citizens, about $23 million, and redid the Capitol, the mansion, everything else. Fortunately, since then, Republican Democrats have done things to improve the appearance of the Capitol, but that dome and then the art, and I participated in a lot of that with other leaders to make that a visible and visited facility, and that's what it is today.
Well, I know we have to wrap up soon, but so much of this conversation has always been you as the lone Republican or the outnumbered Republican. If somebody tunes in from the future and we're sitting here in 2023, they'll scratch their head and say, well, what happened to all the Democrats here in Oklahoma? This is a Republican state. Republicans dominate the legislature, the elective offices. What happened?
Well, you have to ask Democrats that. I mean, I got to be honest with you. You know, why?
He's a retired politician, but a good one.
Oh yeah, but why haven't we gotten rid of the personal and corporate income tax to mirror Texas, which is a country, and to see what they've done to become rich? Because the Republicans in many districts, particularly in rural Oklahoma, are still Democrats, and the teachers' unions. Why in the world do we have such miserable achievement records? I mean, it's disgraceful. We can do it right. Booker T. Washington was academically one of the worst schools in Tulsa. Now it's the best school in Tulsa. So we can do it. Oklahoma School of Science and Math, created by a Democrat governor, and I really encourage it to do an excellent job of educating the young. But we ought to do what I did with OU and OSU and find out, why have we not been able to really knock it out of the park in many areas? Why? Because the kids don't take out hard enough courses in school, and we still have a personal corporate income tax. You shouldn't, in my judgment, you shouldn't pay taxes if you work. You should pay taxes if you consume. And that's Tennessee's news story. That's Texas's story, and you can say, well, but I paid more property taxes. Well, yeah, and you live in a nicer home. You can rent an apartment if you want, but if you consume, you ought to pay taxes. And on that note, I think I got to run.
You got to run, Governor. Thank you so much.
You're
on behalf
welcome.
of the University of Georgia.
Well,
Thank you very much, Governor.